The auctioneer's voice cut through the cold October air like a blade, and nobody was paying attention to the blind mare in the far pen. It was the 14th of October, 1974, in Harlan County, Kentucky, and the Delaney farm auction had drawn most of the county to its muddy yard by 9 in the morning. The Delaney family had worked 300 acres on the north side of Loyal for 2 generations. And when old Chester Delaney died without a son to take the land, everything went to auction. The tractors, the plows, the hay equipment, the cattle, the fencing wire still on the spools, and the horses. People had driven from 3 counties away for the tractors. The International Harvester, 1,066 alone, drew 12 bidders and went for $6,400 to a man from Bell County who pumped the auctioneer's hand like he'd won something at the state fair. People moved from lot to lot with purpose, coffee in hand, catalogues folded under their arms, boots already caked with the red clay mud that had softened overnight from a week of autumn rain. The air smelled of diesel and wood smoke and the particular sharpness of October in the Kentucky mountains. Children ran between the legs of adults. Women clustered near the household lots. Men gathered near the machinery with the serious, squinting expressions of people making calculations. The pen at the back of the property, where a grey Appaloosa mare stood with her head low and her clouded eyes aimed at nothing, drew only a few glances and a few comments, none of them kind. She was 7 years old. Both eyes had gone opaque from a case of moon blindness. Equine recurrent uveitis, the vet had called it, though the Delaney family had not called the vet until it was already too late for either eye. The condition had progressed through 2 summers without proper treatment, and by the time Chester Delaney's health declined, enough that the farm's animals stopped receiving proper attention, the mare's world had gone entirely dark. She had not been worked in 18 months. She was thin along the spine, her winter coat coming in patchy and uneven, and she stood very still in the corner of the pen with her nose pointed towards the fence, reading the wind. She had learned that stillness was the safest response to a world she could no longer see coming. The auctioneer, a red-faced man named Collins who drove up from Middlesbrough for estate sales, opened her bidding at $40 and waited with his gavel raised. Nobody moved. A few men looked at her and looked away. He tried 35. Still nothing. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the small group that had drifted to the back pen out of curiosity rather than intention. He dropped to 30. From somewhere near the fence, a man laughed outright, a full, uncomplicated laugh that invited others to join it. That was when Earl Voss walked through the edge of the crowd, raised his right hand, and said in a voice that carried no particular urgency, 30, I'll take her. He was 61 years old, with a face that had been weathered into something almost geological. Deep lines at the eyes and mouth, skin the colour of old saddle leather, a jaw that had not changed its set expression in 30 years. He had farmed his 112 acres outside of Loyal since 1940, when he was 27 years old, and had paid for the land himself, with money he had saved over 9 years of working other men's farms beginning at age 18. He had survived the lean years of the early 50s and the drought of 1965, and the flood of 1969 that took out his Creekfield Bridge and cost him 6 weeks of work. He had done all of it without a partner, without a son to help, without a single loan that he did not repay ahead of schedule. He maintained his equipment in a barn that was cleaner than most men's kitchens. He kept records in a composition notebook going back to 1941. He knew his land the way surgeons know anatomy, not just the surface of it, but the layers beneath. What drained fast and what held water, where the frost came first, where the soil went heavy after rain. He wore the same canvas jacket he had worn for 11 consecutive winters. It had been dark green once, Now it was the color of old moss, soft at the collar and elbows, with a tear on the left sleeve that he had repaired 3 times with the same brown thread. He moved through crowds the way rivers move around rocks, without announcing himself, without slowing down, simply finding the available space and using it. The auctioneer looked visibly relieved. Sold, $30 to Earl Voss. The laughter that came from the fence in the seconds that followed was not small and not brief. It had the particular quality of laughter that people produce when they feel they have witnessed something that confirms a long-held suspicion. In this case, the suspicion that Earl Voss, for all his years of quiet competence, had finally made a decision that proved he was not as sharp as people had given him credit for. Thomas Greer, who ran the Loyal Farm Supply Cooperative and owned the newest Ford 9600 tractor in the county, leaned both forearms on the top rail of the fence and shook his head with a wide, satisfied smile. Greer was 53 years old, broad through the chest, with the kind of confidence that comes from being right about enough things, often enough that you stop carefully examining each new situation before rendering a verdict. He had built his cooperative into the largest farm supply operation in 3 counties by knowing what worked and backing it loudly, and he had a corresponding impatience with what he judged to be sentiment dressed up as farming wisdom. "Earl Voss," he said, loud enough for the 14 men around him to hear clearly. "Just paid $30 for a horse that cannot see the ground she's walking on." He let the sentence sit for a moment. "A blind horse, on a working farm." He turned to the man on his right. "What do you suppose he's planning to do with her?" Dale Hutchins, who ran a farm equipment sales lot on Route 119 and who had been trying for 3 years to sell Earl Voss a new tractor without success, called over the fence rail with a grin that showed most of his teeth. "Earl, you plan to lead her around by the ear? Maybe put a bell on yourself so she knows where you went?" This produced genuine laughter from the crowd, not the polite kind. A younger man named Roy Cassidy, who had bought the Aldrich Farms South parcel the previous year and was still in the phase of farming where he believed that newer always meant better, shook his head and said to nobody in particular, "I've seen some things at auctions. That might be the strangest $30 ever spent in this county." Earl did not look up from signing the receipt on Collins's clipboard. He signed his name in the same careful block letters he used for everything, folded his copy twice, and put it in the breast pocket of the canvas jacket. He handed the pen back to Collins without comment. Then he walked to the back pen, opened the gate with the practiced motion of a man who has opened 10,000 gates, and stepped inside. He did not reach for the mare immediately. He stood 3 feet inside the gate and went completely still, letting his presence settle into the space. The mare's head came up, her nostrils opened wide, reading him. The smell of his coat, his hands, the particular combination of hay and axle grease and wood smoke that was Earl Voss. Her ears moved forward, then swiveled, measuring the sounds around her. Earl spoke to her, not loudly. The men at the fence leaned in to try to catch the words and couldn't. Whatever he said it in the register he reserved for things that mattered and didn't need witnesses. After perhaps 30 seconds, he took 2 steps toward her and put his right hand flat against the left side of her neck, just below the jaw. He held it there without pressure. She did not move away. Her breathing, which had been slightly elevated, came down. He moved his hand slowly back along her neck to her shoulder, and she turned her head slightly toward him, her nose finding his sleeve. He clipped a lead rope to her halter with his left hand, turned, and walked toward the gate. She walked beside him with her nose 2 inches from his left shoulder, reading his movement, following the pressure of the rope with a lightness that surprised anyone watching closely enough to notice. When he loaded her into his trailer, She hesitated for 3 seconds at the ramp, 3 seconds of her feet reading the hollow sound of the wood beneath them. And then she walked up in a single smooth motion and stood quietly while Earl latched the trailer. Thomas Greer was still at the fence. He watched the trailer disappear up the lane and said to the small crowd that had gathered around him, in the particular gravity of a good story, $30, and that horse will be back on the market inside of 6 months, or I will personally buy Earl Voss a steak dinner at the Harlan Diner. Dale Hutchins said he'd take that bet. Several men around them laughed. The conversation moved on to the International Harvester that had just sold, and the mare in Earl Voss's trailer was mostly forgotten before he had turned onto the county road. What none of the men at that fence knew, what Earl Voss had never told anyone at a fence or a feed store or a co-op counter, was that he had been preparing for that horse his entire life. Not that horse specifically, but the knowledge of how to work with her. That knowledge had come from his father, and it had come in the worst possible circumstances, which is how the most important knowledge usually arrives. In January of 1944, Raymond Voss was dying. He was 58 years old, and a lung condition that had been advancing quietly for 3 years had reached the point where he could not leave his bed on cold mornings. Earl was 11, old enough to understand what was happening, young enough that the understanding had not yet built the walls around itself that adult grief constructs for protection. Raymond had farmed the Voss 112 acres since 1927. He had bought the land 2 years before the Depression hit, and had held on to it through the worst years by a combination of stubbornness, precision, and the complete absence of waste in any form. In those Depression years, Raymond had worked with what was available, which was rarely much. He had learned to extract full performance from equipment that any reasonable buyer would have condemned. He had learned to read animals with the patience of a man who cannot afford to replace them if they break down, reading their gaits, their moods, their particular signals of distress or willingness. And he had kept working through those years with a Belgian draft horse named Porter, who was already old when the hard times started, and who had, by 1944, lost most of his useful vision to age and to the cumulative damage of working in bright fields without the protection that younger, better-fed eyes provide. Porter was 21 years old and nearly blind when Raymond Voss called Earl to his bedside in February of 1944 and talked to him for 3 hours. Not about the war, which was consuming the attention of every family in the county. Not about money, though money was always close to the surface in that house. He talked about Porter. He explained, with the methodical precision of a man who knows he is transferring something that cannot be lost, exactly how to work a horse that cannot see. He told Earl that a blind horse does not work from sight. It works from memory, from pattern, from the consistent signals of a handler it has learned to trust absolutely. He told Earl that the handler's job is not to guide the horse around obstacles, but to teach the horse the land so thoroughly that the land itself becomes a kind of vision, absorbed through feet and ears and the accumulated knowledge of 1,000 repetitions. He told Earl that a horse worked this way, patiently and precisely, will not fail you. It will, in fact, work with a concentration and a steadiness that a sighted horse rarely matches, because it has no distractions, no sudden movements at the edge of its vision, nothing pulling its attention from the task in its feet. Raymond died in April of 1944. Earl was 11 years old, and he worked Porter through the spring planting that year, walking every field with the old horse before he asked him to pull on it, talking to him, building the map. He ploughed the creek field 3 weeks after his father died with a 21-year-old, nearly blind Belgian draft horse, and he did not find it remarkable, because his father had taught him that it was not remarkable. It was simply the correct application of attention and patience to the tools you had available. Porter worked 2 more seasons. He died in the fall of 1945, and Earl buried him in the corner of the east field under the walnut tree and went on. He had not worked with a blind horse since, but he had not forgotten a single word his father had told him that February. And when he stood at the back of the Delaney auction and saw the grey Appaloosa standing alone in the far pen while everyone else looked at tractors, he felt something click into alignment the way things do when a long-prepared circumstance finally arrives. He paid $30 and drove home. The first 2 weeks were entirely about learning. Earl did not ask November. He named her November for the month of the year, plain and practical, the way he named everything, to do anything except exist on his farm and begin building her map of it. He led her from the barn to the water trough every morning and every evening. The same path, the same pace, narrating the turns in a low voice. Left here, step down here, the ground levels here. He walked her to the east fence and back. He walked her along the south field edge where the creek ran. He let her stand at the gate to the creek field for 10 minutes each morning and read the sounds of the water and the specific way the wind moved through the low ground there. He was patient in the way that a man is patient when he is not doing something difficult, but simply doing something that takes the time it takes, like curing wood or waiting for ground to dry after rain. By the 3rd week of November had the path from the barn to the east fence fully memorized. Earl could feel it in the way she walked it, no longer reading, no longer cautious, but moving with a settled certainty that came from knowledge deposited and stored. He put a light collar on her and attached a drag, nothing heavy, just a section of log chain, and walked her down the east path. She pulled without hesitation, found the turns by memory, brought the drag back to the barn without a single correction from the rope. Earl stood in his barn that evening and allowed himself the small satisfaction of a man who has seen exactly what he expected to see. Through November and into December, he built her map field by field, path by path, always walking each new route on foot with her before adding any load, always introducing new sections in the same patient sequence. By January, she knew the full perimeter of his farm and the main working paths through the 4 primary fields. By February, he put her in full harness for the first time and asked her to pull a single-bottom plough down the creek field, which she knew better than any other. She leaned into the collar and the plough bit, and she walked that row straight, and even from the north fence to the walnut tree, and turned. She felt the turn coming from the change in Earl's pressure on the guideline, a pressure they had practiced together until it was a language both of them spoke without thinking, and she came back the other direction without breaking stride. Earl ploughed 4 rows that February afternoon. He stopped when she showed the first signs of tiring, unhooked her, walked her to water, and spent 20 minutes brushing her down in the barn while the winter dark came on. Outside, he talked to her while he worked, not because he thought she understood the words, but because the sound of his voice was part of the map she was building. The sound of safety, the sound of the handler who knew where things were and would not ask her to go anywhere he hadn't already prepared her for. He fed her and latched her stall and walked to his house in the full dark and ate supper alone, as he always did, and he thought that Porter would have approved of her. Spring came. The county's farms woke up from winter, and the roads filled with tractors moving between fields. And Thomas Greer took delivery of a new Ford 9600 that he drove down Main Street in Loyal on a Saturday morning as if he were piloting something historic. Dale Hutchins sold 3 new balers in April alone. The feed store ran low on herbicide. The cooperative buzzed with the business of a new growing season, and the conversations in it were about yields and prices and equipment, and nobody in those conversations was thinking about Earl Voss's blind mare. Earl was thinking about his corn. He had 112 acres to manage and a horse who was ready to work, and by the first week of April-November was pulling a cultivator down his early corn rows with the steadiness of an animal that has known this ground for a full winter and trusts it completely. She did not drift from the rows. She did not spook at the crow that landed 8 feet to her right on the fence post, or the truck that rattled past on the county road, or the sound of Pete Aldrich's tractor working the neighbouring field with its diesel knock carrying across the open air. She had no visual distraction, no sudden peripheral movement to interpret and react to. She had only the path, and the path was hers. Earl walked beside her with a loose hand on the guideline, and most mornings he did not need to use it at all. The summer of 1975 settled the question for anyone who had been paying attention with any seriousness. July brought 10 straight dry days that turned the creekfield soil hard at the surface, while the corn in its critical growth phase needed cultivation and hilling before the next dry stretch arrived. Earl calculated 2 days, maybe 2.5, before the window closed. He started before 5 in the morning on a Tuesday, working by lantern until the light came up, and November worked beside him without complaint from that pre-dawn grey through the full heat of the afternoon. 10 hours of work, straight rows, consistent depth, no missed passes, no wandering lines, no sections that would need to be redone. When Earl stopped her in the afternoon and walked her to the creek to drink, she was tired in the clean way that honest work produces, deep in the muscle, quiet in the manner, ready to rest, and then ready again. They finished the creek field in a day and 4 hours, well inside the window. The corn came through the dry stretch without significant damage. Earl noted it in his composition book, with the same neutral handwriting he used for everything, the way a man records facts rather than victories. Pete Aldrich had seen her working from the road in June. He had stopped his truck and watched for 20 minutes without getting out, his arm on the open window, his expression moving through several stages that he could not quite have named. What he was watching did not fit neatly into any category his experience had prepared for it. A blind horse working a field with the precision of something that could see perfectly, guided by a man who moved beside her with the ease of long habit. He drove on, and he was quieter about Earl Voss's blind mare from that point forward. And then he was not quiet about it at all, which was how the story began to spread. Thomas Greer heard variations of it through the winter of 1975 and into 1976. He received each version with the particular skepticism of a man who is publicly committed to a position and needs more evidence than most to change it. He had told 14 people that $30 was the most misspent money in the county. Revising that verdict required a proportional amount of proof. The proof arrived personally in July of 1977. Greer's registered Belgian draft horse, purchased the previous fall at considerable expense, 16 hands, strong and young and expensively documented, colicked in June in the serious way, the way that has 2 outcomes and one of them is fatal. The vet came twice. The horse survived but came out of it weakened and off work for 6 weeks. Greer's tractor was simultaneously at the dealer in Harlan for a repair that had stretched into its 3rd week, because a part had to come from Cincinnati. He had a hay contract with a lumber operation in Bell County that had a fixed delivery date and no flexibility. He sat in his truck on a Thursday morning at the end of Earl Voss's lane, with both hands on the wheel and the engine idling, hating the specific arithmetic of his situation. Earl came out of the barn and walked to the truck. He had seen it turn in from the field and had taken his time washing his hands at the barn spigot before coming out. Not to make Greer wait, but because clean hands were a matter of habit. Greer got out of the truck. He was not a man who stumbled over words, but he took a moment before he produced these ones, and the moment was visible. He said he had a hay contract he needed to meet, and he was short a working horse, and his tractor was in the shop. And he wanted to know if Earl would rent him November for 2 weeks at a fair rate. Earl said, "Come look at her first." They walked to the back field in silence, the kind of silence that exists between two men when one of them has something to apologize for and is working up to it, and the other one is not going to help him get there any faster. November was working the far section of the hay ground, pulling a mowing bar down a long straight run of timothy and clover, the cut falling clean and even behind her. She moved at a steady walking pace, her ears forward, her head at the level that indicated focused work, her grey coat dark with the effort and the July heat. Greer stood at the field edge and watched her for a long time. 4 full passes. He watched the way she held her lines, the way she found the turn at the far end, the way she brought herself back without Earl needing to do anything visible with the guideline. He said, finally, "She really does it?" Earl said, "Has done it every day for 3 years." Greer put his hands in his pockets and looked at the cut hay lying in its clean windows behind the mare. Then he looked at the rows ahead of her, and the rows behind, and the consistency between them. He said, quietly, in a voice that was not performing anything for anyone, "I was wrong about her." Earl let that sit for a moment. Then he said, "She was always that horse. You just didn't have the information yet." It was the most generous interpretation of events that Greer could have been offered, and he received it accordingly. Not with relief exactly, but with the particular stillness of a man who has been given more grace than he deserved, and knows it. Earl did not rent November for the hay contract, not because he was holding a grudge. Grudges required an investment of attention that Earl did not have to spare, but because he needed her himself that week. He said so plainly, and Greer nodded and drove away. And that was that. But the afternoon at the field edge had changed something between the two men that could not be unchanged. The laughter at the Delaney auction had been permanent, and this was also permanent, and the second thing had quietly overwritten the first. November's 11 foals arrived over 17 years, the first in March of 1976 and the last in the spring of 1992, when she was 24 years old, and her working days had shortened to the morning hours on familiar ground. Earl kept 5 of the 11 and sold 6, and he sold every one of them with a careful explanation of where they came from and what that lineage meant, not in terms of papers or registration, but in terms of the temperament that came from an animal that had learned to work without sight, to trust without hesitation, to give its full attention to the task in front of it because attention was all it had. People bought those foals differently than they bought other horses. They came back and told Earl things. A man from Bell County said the gelding he'd bought from Earl in 1981 was the quietest, most consistent horse he'd ever put in harness. A woman who ran a small farm outside of Cumberland said the filly she'd purchased in 1984 had a steadiness that her other horses seemed to catch, like a temperature in a room. Earl nodded at these reports and filed them the same place he filed everything, in the composition notebook, in plain handwriting, without commentary. Thomas Greer told the story of the Delaney auction for the first time in 1985 to a young farmer at the cooperative who was considering whether to pass over a good older horse because of a minor lameness that the vet said was manageable. Greer told it fully. He included the $30. He included his own laughter at the fence. He included the afternoon in Earl's hayfield in July of 1977, when he stood and watched and understood that he had been wrong about something important for 3 years. He told it the way a man tells a story he has paid for with his own embarrassment and therefore owns completely. The young farmer bought the horse. It worked his place for 11 years. Dale Hutchins told it more often and with more embellishment, as was his nature, but the core of it stayed honest. The blind mare, the $30, the laughter, and what came after. He told it at the feed store, at the diner, at two different farm auctions in the early 80s, always ending in the same place. Standing at that fence in 1974, laughing at Earl Voss and thinking about it ever since. November worked her last full season in 1992. She was 24 years old, and she walked the Eastfield path, the one she had learned first. In the cold November of 1974, when Earl had led her back and forth, along it for a week, before asking her to pull anything, with the same quiet authority she had always carried. Slower now, shorter in the stride, more careful in the way of old things that have learned to conserve what they have. But without a wrong step, because wrong steps had never been part of what she knew on this ground. She had built this land into herself over 19 years, until it was as much a part of her as her own breathing. Earl walked beside her on those mornings exactly as he had always walked, left shoulder at her right cheek, guideline loose, the low voice at the turns. They had covered more miles of this ground together than either of them could have counted. Every field, every path, every change in the soil under the feet where the clay gave way to gravel near the creek, where the north field went soft after rain, where the walnut tree at the corner of the east field threw its roots in a way you could feel if you were paying attention. She died in March of 1993, in her stall, in the night. Earl found her in the early grey of morning and stood with her for a long time without moving. He did not say anything about it to anyone in town. He did not need to. Word travelled the way it travelled in Harlan County, through the co-op and the feed store and the diner on Route 119, through the particular rural telegraph of people whose lives are close enough together that nothing important stays private for long. Within a week, most of the people who had been at the Delaney auction in October of 1974 knew that November was gone. Thomas Greer heard it on a Tuesday at the cooperative. He was 65 and had been out of active farming for 2 years. He stood at the counter with his coffee and heard it from Pete Aldrich, and he was quiet for a moment in the way of a man doing arithmetic that goes beyond numbers. He said, 19 years, Aldrich said, and 11 foals, 6 of them still working farms in 3 counties. Greer set his coffee on the counter. He looked out the window at the parking lot, at the trucks and the muddy cars and the ordinary Tuesday morning of a small Kentucky farm town, and he thought about a grey Appaloosa mare with clouded eyes standing alone at the back of the Delaney auction while everyone else looked at tractors, and about a 61-year-old man in a worn canvas jacket who raised his hand for $30 and knew something that the whole county did not. He did not say anything else. There was nothing left to say that 19 years and 11 foals had not already said better than he could. Earl Voss kept farming. He was 79 years old in 1993, and he had slowed in the way of a man who has done the same things for 50 years and no longer wastes motion on anything unnecessary. He worked with November's granddaughter on the light morning tasks and a younger gelding on the heavier afternoon work, and he maintained his equipment in the clean barn, and he kept his records in the composition book, and he got up before sunrise because that was what the farm required. Some mornings he walked the Eastfield path himself, without a horse, without any particular purpose. Just walked it. The walnut tree at the turn had grown another ring for every year since November had first learned to feel for it in the dark. The ground was the same ground his father had farmed, that he had farmed for 50 years. That November had learned foot by foot, with her eyes closed and her ears open, and every part of her attention given to the man who walked beside her and had never once asked her to go anywhere he hadn't already prepared her for. He had paid $30 for a blind mare that a county full of men with good eyes had looked at and seen nothing worth having. She had given him 19 years and 11 foals, and the confirmation of something his father had told him in a cold room in February of 1944, which was that what a thing can do and what it looks like it can do are often entirely different measurements. And the only way to know which is to pay close enough attention for long enough. Most people are not willing to do that. They look at what's in front of them and make their decision in the time it takes a gavel to fall, and they walk away, satisfied that they saw clearly. The ones who see clearly are usually the ones who take a little longer.